Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Resident and Family Support Council meeting that we hold on the second and the fourth Tuesday of every month at 3 o'clock. And like I always say, remember this link is the same link that will take you to every single meeting. So put it someplace that you can access it whenever you want so that you can get to these meetings because we have a lot of really, really great topics. But if by chance you can't make one of our meetings, we do record these and we put them onto our YouTube channel. And those, I believe we've got Stephen will be working in the background, putting all of those links into the chat for us so that you could be able to access that. But it's IL Ombudsman Program is where you can find the YouTube recordings at. And there are, I think at this point, we're up to about 70 recordings, and they're on such a variety of topics that they really can help navigate this long-term care path, which can be pretty confusing at times. Just as a reminder, I am Lee Moriarty, and I'm the Deputy State Long-Term Care Ombudsman with the state of Illinois. And we have these meetings get hosted by the Illinois Pioneer Coalition, who kindly allows us to use their Zoom account so that we can have these meetings via Zoom. So we really do appreciate that. And actually today I am at the Illinois Pioneer Coalition Conference. I snuck away and I'm over in a breakout room being able to talk with all of us today. So I'm having a great day meeting and networking with everybody, hearing about person-directed living and how we could do a better job of advocating for people who live in long-term care, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to have today's topic. We've got Dana Wilkinson with us today, and Dana works for the Department of Advocacy and Prevention Services for the Illinois Department on Aging. So we work for the same entity, the Department on Aging, but Dana's in a different division from me. And she looks to make sure that people are protected, particularly those that are living in the community. So she's going to share with us about what they do over there. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation because this is something that is really important that everyone understands that your rights need to be listened to, and we don't want anybody taking advantage of any seniors, people aging in Illinois. So Dana, welcome.
Thank you. Okay,
We're excited that you could be here with us today.
I'm excited to be able to talk about APS with you, and I can talk about a couple of instances where we actually do cover individuals that reside in long-term care facilities.
Great.
So my boxes are all in the wrong spot. Let me get to the point where I can fix the slide. Okay, that should do it for us. Let me move everybody's cute little faces out of the way.
There we
All
go.
right. Well, thank you, Lee, for having us today or having me today. Unfortunately, Brian is under the weather and couldn't make it, but I am here to talk about the Adult Protective Services Program, which we refer to as APS, of course. And like Lee said, the APS program is administered through the Illinois Department on Aging. We currently have approximately, and I say approximately because we're in a period of transition, but we have about 24 APS provider agencies across the state of Illinois. So maybe some similarities to the Ombuds program, some differences. We do have provider agencies that range from domestic violence facilities to developmental disability facilities, aging entities that serve as our provider agencies that go into the communities and do the investigations for us. We like to say repeatedly, I think I say it at least 3 times, that we encourage you to report any suspicion of abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation. So you can see that number on the first slide here, 1-866-800-1409, and that's going to appear a few times over the course of my presentation. But just to give you a little background on Adult Protective Services, our goal really is to reduce the risk of abuse or neglect or exploitation happening to anyone over the age of 60 or 18 to 59 with a disability. We want to work with individuals to investigate any allegations, develop care plans to reduce that risk or hopefully eliminate it. We want to reduce the risk that any type of abuse would occur again, and we want people to remain as independent as possible. Those are kind of our guiding principles when we talk about adult protective services. Jumping right in Illinois, we have what we call limited mandated reporting. So we encourage everyone to make a report, but individuals who are licensed in the state of Illinois, maybe not every licensure, but many of them. Anyone who works in the aging network, except for people working in the ombudsman program. There is an exclusion for individuals that work in that program. They are considered mandated reporters. A little different than child abuse reporting, our mandated reporters only report if someone is unable to do so for themselves. So that's the only time they're mandated to report, and it has to be during the course of their work. So when they're off duty, they're not called to report. So as a licensed clinical social worker, that's a little different from me because I'm called to report allegations of child abuse anytime. But for adult protective services, I only have to report those things I'm aware of through the course of my work, and only if an individual is unable to report for themselves.
And
Just
Dana,
like in child.
if I could interject as to why ombudsman can't, we are not mandated reporters, because we are resident directed. So everything that a resident tells us is held in complete confidence. So we are not allowed to divulge anything that they share with us unless they give us permission. And even if we see something happening, we are not allowed to report it unless the resident tells us that we can report it. So if a staff member might be being verbally abusive and we're witnessing it while we're at a nursing home, we are not a mandated reporter and we will not report that unless the resident tells us that it's okay to do that. So I just wanted to make clear it's not that ombudsmen are trying to, because that's always that point that comes up, Dana, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
Yes, yes, thank you for that, Lee. And I also want to say about APS is that even though we do have that mandated reporting requirement, and we'll get into this later, but we also do take self-determination very seriously. So we also are very individual focused. So before we start that investigation, we're going to ask that individual if they're willing to participate. And if they're not, then we do step back as well. So we have some similar clauses within our. Thinking back to mandated reporting, I do just want to say that anyone that makes a report in good faith is protected under our act for any type of criminal liability or civil liability, and any type of act of retaliation that a person might face on a job or in a similar situation. And there is a link to our act in this presentation that we can send out if you'd like to see if you happen to be employed in an area where you might be a mandated reporter.
And we can put the slides on our website page under our Resident Family Support Council so that everybody can have access to this. That would be great.
That's perfect. A couple of other things about reporting. The reporter's identity is one of the things that we do keep highly confidential. There are only two reasons that we would release a reporter's identity. And the first is if the reporter gives us permission to do so. And the second is if requested by a judge. Only the judge at an in-camera inspection has access to the reporter's identity. So you can be sure that you're protected in that way as well. So let's talk about the type of things that we would accept reports for. There's a list here on your screen, and we're going to quickly go through each of these. Lee, if you see any questions that I need to address in the chat, do stop me because I tend to go through these things a little quickly and I'm not seeing the chat at this time. So I'm happy to pause and answer questions as you have those.
Got it.
Okay. So physical abuse, and that's probably something that most people could readily identify. If someone's been hit, pushed, slapped, you can see some examples on the screen here. One thing I think people don't think about is over-medicating. We include that within the physical abuse category. So unfortunately, there are times that we see, oh, I need to, maybe a caregiver says, I really need to take a break. I need them to sleep for a little while. I'm going to give them some extra medication. Well, clearly this is an inappropriate action and something that we would investigate. So when you're talking with individuals, I always like to bring up that you may not see the bruising, but if people seem timid, if they have an increased amount of space between you and them, they're very reactive to noise or sounds. We might say if they're hypervigilant. Those are things that you might want to explore a little bit to see if they might be a victim of some type of abuse, physical abuse especially. And we'll talk a little bit more about other signs as well. Sexual abuse, any sexual activity with an eligible adult who is unable to understand, unwilling to consent, threatened or physically forced to engage in any type of sexual activity. It doesn't have to be something physical. It could be watching things that they chose not to watch that might be of a sexual nature, being exposed to radio programs or things like that. And we take this very seriously because we think about some of the conditions that or disabilities that we work with in adult protective services may impair a person's ability to consent. And so we're going to take that into consideration when we look at these allegations. Does that person have the capacity to consent? If not, then we will initiate an investigation related to sexual abuse. Emotional abuse. These are the type of things where you have threats, threats to a person's safety, threats to take things away from individuals, saying or doing things that could be of a humiliating nature. I was trying to think of an example for you. I don't have a good example right now. Destruction of property could be another form of emotional abuse. And one thing that it's fairly common is taking people's pets away, because we all have a pretty strong connection to our pets if we have them in our home. And people can use that as a way of intimidating individuals and getting them to do something that they don't want to do, or force them to do something that they don't want to. So those are the two ways that emotional abuse can be facilitated. Confinement is a type of abuse that we investigate. Of course, you may think of the situation where someone is not allowed to leave a room. We see this sometimes with caregivers who feel like they're doing what they can for an individual. They know that the individual has a history of wandering. They wake up maybe in the middle of the night, they leave the residence, so they put a lock on the door that the person can't access. We understand that this is one method of trying to keep someone safe, but it's also very dangerous. If there was an emergency, that person could not get out. If someone had to assist, they might have trouble finding the lock, the key, or whatever the containment method might be. So it is not something that is allowable, and something that we would discuss with the individual and investigate as a type of abuse. There's other ways of confining individuals, however, some I'm sure that you're familiar with through the Ombudsman program, is not allowing individuals to see people that they wish to see, not allowing them to see other family members, children, or just relationships that they have. Taking a person's phone from them or not allowing them access to their telephone would be further examples of confinement. Abandonment is similar to neglect when we speak about neglect, but abandonment implies that there's an individual who is in the care and custody of someone else, which is pretty loosely defined. So if an individual doesn't have the ability to leave on their own because maybe of their disability or their current impairment, and there's been an individual who has provided care for them, and that individual stops providing that care without arranging some other type of services, this would be an incident of abandonment. I do like to pause here for a second and describe what abandonment is not, because you'll see in this definition toward the latter part that it says where a reasonable person would continue services. And the intention of this is to avoid situations where an individual feels like they cannot keep their loved one safe. So think back to that situation where the person continues to get up at night, wander away, wander out in traffic, walk down railroad tracks, they live on a busy street. They've done everything they could short of locking them in to keep that person safe, and they just don't feel like that's safe anymore. If that person refuses to take that person home because they cannot keep them safe, we do not consider that abandonment. We feel like there needs to be a better plan for that individual that's going to ensure that everyone's safety. And another example of that would be if the individual is aggressive. So we see this a lot with our younger population, maybe people who struggle to communicate, and they sometimes become aggressive in order to try and get a need met or something along those lines. But it's gotten to the point where others in the home are not safe. That individual has a right, if that person were to become hospitalized or something along those lines, to say, I cannot keep myself and the others in the home safe. We have to work on a better discharge plan. So those are things that would not be considered abandonment. Okay, I mentioned neglect before. We look at neglect in a few different ways. And again, I want to pause here and say that APS is an advocacy intervention model. What that means is we're going to provide services clearly to that alleged victim, but we're also going to offer services to that alleged abuser because we recognize that there are times that people don't set out to be neglectful. They don't set out to be abusive. The example I just gave, I think I'm protecting my loved one by locking the door, but not recognizing that there are many pitfalls to that and it is considered abuse. That person didn't intentionally say, I've had enough. I'm putting them in there and they're not coming out. They said, I want to keep them safe. So we're going to help educate them. We're going to help find services that are going to meet their needs. Other examples may be, and more commonly, what we do see is we have two individuals that are aging together. One is caring for the other one, but then the caregiver starts to get ill. And now you have two individuals that require care. And in the meantime, the person that was receiving the care starts to deteriorate, maybe starts to develop some bed sores, lose some weight. When we're made aware of that situation, we're going to go in and we're going to investigate an allegation of neglect, but recognizing that that caregiver needs assistance. And so those kinds of things we call passive neglect. There was no ill intent on that person to cause any harm to the individual. So they didn't withhold like food, clothing, shelter, medication in an attempt to punish or out of anger or frustration. They did it because, of some other extenuating circumstance. The opposite of that is really the willful deprivation. We're still going to investigate these the same, and we're still going to offer services to this individual. But those are the services, those are the kind of neglectful situation where there was some malice in the situation. There was some intent to harm. And then finally, we have self-neglect. It's a little bit different than those two types of neglect in that self-neglect is when a person becomes unable because of a medical condition to care for themselves. And it progresses to the point that there's a substantial threat to their health, welfare, or safety. So if you think about that situation I was talking about where you have the two individuals that are aging together, maybe there's only one, and that person's been caring for themselves. They're fairly isolated, and now they just can't get out and get their needs met. This may become a situation that we would consider self-neglect. We also see this a lot with people who have behavioral health challenges. People become depressed to the point that they just don't have the energy to care for their basic needs. And so they stop caring for their needs, and someone sounds the alarm bell and APS goes in and offers services to that individual to hopefully get them on track, give them some support that they need to resolve some of their issues. And then, of course, we have financial exploitation. And this is the situation where an individual is using someone's resources to their own benefit. So this is our number one type of abuse, although I would say that self-neglect is really gaining on it over the last few years, and we expect that self-neglect will probably overtake financial exploitation. But this is a situation where you have a caregiver, a family member, or someone like that who is taking money or taking some type of resource. They may be using a person's home without their knowledge. Person gets hospitalized or placed in some type of long but temporary kind of situation, and they move into their home and then they don't wish to leave or something like that. So APS will involve itself in those situations and conduct the investigation as appropriate. So again, we really do encourage you, if you have any suspicion of harm to anyone, if you see those signs where people are withdrawing, and let me just say here too that, people respond to abuse differently, whether it's abuse or financial exploitation. Some people do withdraw, some people get angry. I know people who are depressed, which can be something that occurs, of course, when you're in an abusive situation. But instead of outwardly presenting as depressed, they may appear frustrated, short-tempered, they may yell. The most important thing is if you know that individual and they're acting some way that's not their usual presentation, there's some type of change in behavior, that's when those alarm bells should go off for you to say, what's going on? What's different? Is there someone new in their life? Is there anything that I see? Is there bruising? Have they lost weight? Is their hair not as kempt as it was before? Those are some kinds of things that you might want to be thinking about. It's always okay to call that helpline. The senior helpline takes our APS calls during the day. And it's always okay to call and ask questions. In fact, of every four, I'm going to cite a statistic here that I wasn't really prepared for, but it seems appropriate. But out of about every 4 calls about an APS report, we only take 1. So a lot of people are calling, and they maybe don't have enough information. They don't have the right information. So please don't hesitate to call and even ask questions if you need to. There are a few other criteria that have to be met in order for us to take a report. So we've talked about the allegations. One of those things needs to be occurring. We also want to stress, like I've mentioned, that the individual has to be over the age of 60 or 18 to 59 with a disability. We don't have to have proof of disability. If you tell us or the individual tells us they're disabled, we're going to go ahead and move forward with that investigation. We do need the abuse to have occurred within the last 12 months, or the abuse, the results of the abuse are continuing. So if someone was hit or pushed and it caused permanent damage to a bodily part, that would be something that we could continue to investigate. One that maybe you might not think about is financial exploitation. If you have a situation where an individual, if they've lost their life savings to a caregiver or someone else, and it's caused them to not be able to seek the services that they need, to maybe be homeless or something like that, then that is a continuing issue, and we would investigate those allegations as well. Okay, so the alleged abuse has to have occurred outside of a long-term care facility, or here's where there are 2 exceptions to that. If it's financial exploitation and it's someone outside of the facility, so it's not an individual that works at the facility, but maybe it's a relative that has access to their bank account and they're slowly ciphering off money, then APS can still investigate that even if the individual is in a long-term care facility. The other type of investigation we can conduct is if the individual leaves the long-term care facility and is in the community when the abuse occurs. That would be something that we can investigate. And that happens a lot with community integrated living arrangements or SILA arrangements for individuals who are younger with maybe developmental disabilities. And then finally, we need the abuse to be conducted by an identifiable abuser. And what we're really talking about here is we don't do scams and frauds. So an individual who maybe is a victim of a romance scam online or some other type of internet scam, we don't have access to interview that alleged abuser, to work with them to provide those services. And so that does not fall under APS jurisdiction. That would be something that we could refer to the National Fraud Elder Abuse, the National Fraud and Abuse Hotline or the Attorney General's office. There's one more thing I wanted to say about that. Oh, yes. We also don't look into allegations of kind of landlord-tenant or neighbor issues. So just to be clear, so if the allegation was that my neighbor plays this music too loud, I can't get any sleep, well, that's something that any of us could face in the course of our lives, of course. And so that would not be something that we would investigate. However, if that neighbor is providing some type of service to the individual, they get them groceries, they help them with their bills, they've been helping with home repairs, and in the course of that, they perpetrate some type of abuse or neglect, then we would get involved. So being a neighbor or being a landlord doesn't excuse them from an investigation, but it has to be not related to some landlord-tenant issue or some neighbor issue. All right. So here's some information that's helpful when you want to make a report. So we want to get names, addresses, all of that kind of demographic information that you can give us. One, we want to be able to locate that individual, but we also want to be able to relate to them well. So any information that you can give us about this is what works best for communicating with this person, whether it be because of a physical disability, an intellectual disability, or something else that you're aware of. We like to get that information. You don't have to have it, but it's helpful to our investigators. We have to know the circumstances surrounding those allegations that we talked about. You believe it's physical abuse. What makes you think that? What have you observed? When does it occur? You know, any information like that that you can help us out with. It not only helps us identify how serious a threat that the person is under at this time, but it also helps us assure the safety of our caseworkers, the more information that you can give us. because we want to make sure that they know the type of environment that they're walking into so that we can keep them safe as well. So do tell us about any immediate dangers, whether it's in that home, there are weapons, there are animals, or even in the neighborhood. Hey, there's been a lot of trouble in this neighborhood, and maybe that's one reason why you're worried about that individual. They won't leave the neighborhood and it's not safe there. We like to know that. We like to know a little bit about the reporter, because what happens, and we'll get into this later, I apologize, but what happens after we take the report, we're going to send that to the local provider agency, and they're going to call the reporter back just to make sure that the report taker got all the information correct and that you didn't think of anything else that might be relevant when you made that report. If you don't wish to be called back, you can say that. In fact, you can make anonymous reports as well. But as long as you don't expressly prohibit that, then we will call you back just to make sure there's not any additional information. If there's others involved in this individual's life that you feel like could be a benefit for APS to talk with, we'd like to have their contact information as well. And then, of course, anything else that you can think about. Okay, so we've received that information, which we call the point of intake. We're given a report. It has all this great information that you've provided. And so our APS caseworker is going to initiate an investigation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We call that sometimes the assessment phase as well. So it's investigation, assessment, but that's going to be about 30 days. We're going to look into that, those allegations to try and determine if we believe that it's likely that they occurred or didn't occur. We have a couple of levels of substantiation, meaning it did occur, but regardless of which level it's substantiated at, we are still going to offer services to that individual. Speaking of self-determination, a person does have a right to refuse those services if they choose so, or they can participate with us in case plan and casework and follow-up services, which can last up to about 15 months after an APS report is made. Okay, so thinking about that first response that we're going to make with the individual, we do an unannounced face-to-face visit because we don't want to give any alleged abusers a heads up on the investigation. We wouldn't want them to start concealing any type of evidence or anything like that. So when we reach out to an individual, we're going to their home without contacting them first, identifying ourselves and asking for their permission to continue. Depending on the urgency of the need for that individual. So when I was talking about what's going on with that individual, how significant is the abuse they're facing, we're going to make a determination at the point of intake whether we need to go out in 24 hours because it's extremely serious, there's a threat to that person's immediate safety, or if it can be 72 to 5 business days. And those just really depend on, again, a lot of the things that fall into the 5 business days would be things like financial exploitation, things that are resolved. Maybe we get a report that this occurred, but the person is now safe, the abuser's gone. Those might be things that could be delayed so that we can focus our resources on those priority 1 cases, those ones that need that immediate response. We talked about that after a report is made that APS is going to call you back. We talked about that they're going to go out and visit that individual for an unannounced face-to-face visit within 24 hours or 5 business days. We also are going to call that report taker back to make sure that they don't have any additional information they might have left off. And with the client's permission or the alleged victim's permission, we're also going to collect those other information from those others with information. So if you said, here's some other people that you might want to contact, we're going to contact them as well. The only time we're going to reach out to them without contacting the client first would be if we can't locate that client and we have a serious concern about their well-being. Then we might contact them. We might say, hey, I'm calling from, and name the provider agency instead of identifying as Adult Protective Services, to say, I need to get a hold of this individual to talk about arranging some services. Do you know where I might locate them? Because our goal is to protect the confidentiality of the individual. Some things that we're going to do. So we've gone in, we've determined that there is a possibility that there could be abuse occurring. We can provide some early intervention services. This is funding typically. So if people need access to food, clothing, shelter, we're going to help them with funds to do that. if they need assistance with getting any type of legal remedy. So they really want an order of protection. Maybe there's a cost to that. We're going to assist with that cost. We're going to get them linked with the right individuals. We're going to offer them supportive counseling. We're going to get them in to see a doctor. All of this, again, is if they agree to do so. And sometimes we need to reach out to law enforcement. There are some things within our act, if there is a significant like loss of consciousness, broken bones, those are things that we have to report to law enforcement immediately. Again, it's all about the threat to the individual and being able to keep them safe. Those are things that might occur, pretty early in the case. In the long term, we're going to do a lot. Long term, we're going to do a lot of referrals to make sure that they have a safety net involved, that once APS backs out, there's still individuals there that can help reduce that risk for them. And that may be medical, social services. Sometimes it's legal remedies. Sometimes people need a guardian because sometimes maybe the guardian was the alleged abuser. And so we need to notify the court that a new guardian needs to be appointed. So those are some kinds of things that we might offer to individuals once we've determined that there is abuse occurring. Like I said, the case is open. It can stay open for about 12 to 15 months from the point of intake. And the cases, we like cases to be closed because the risk is mitigated. We do close cases if the risk is reduced. We close cases if clients choose to. Sometimes we close if people enter long-term care facilities, and you can see some of the other reasons listed here as well. So again, even if you're unsure if a report fits criteria, go ahead and give us a call. We'll talk it through with you. It's always better to err on the side of caution. If you know that someone else is aware of the information, you don't know if they reported or not, go ahead and call it in. It's pretty easy for us to match up cases. You also may have some additional information and we can tag that right onto the other report. And that is not at all problematic for the department. Another interesting thing about APS is we accept reports. In fact, our mandated reporters now have to report suspicious death. So if an individual becomes aware of someone that has passed away, and there is reason to believe that their death may have been the result of abuse or neglect or even exploitation, because remember, if they don't have the funds to purchase necessary items, it could be that harmful to an individual. Then our mandated reporters have to call those in to our hotline. And we don't investigate suspicious deaths ourselves, but what we do is we contact law enforcement and coroner's office to make sure that they are aware of those situations. And then they, as they deem appropriate, because they are the experts, initiate those investigations. And we follow up in about 30 days to see if there's been any progress in the case, if there's anything we can glean from that investigation. On the screen now, you'll see some possible indicators that their death may have been related to abuse or neglect. And we won't go through all of those, but like Lee said, these will be available to you. There's our hotline number again, 866-800-1409. All right, so sometimes after you make a report, you feel guilty about the situation because again, not all abuse is willful. And we want you to know, we remind you that we recognize that as well. And, take solace in the fact that we are working with that alleged abuser as well to get the services they need to get back on track. We do encourage you not to reach out to the individual and inform them of the investigation for lots of reasons, but one that could put our caseworkers at risk. If the abuser becomes aware of the report and they're prepared for that caseworker to come, we don't know what the situation will be like. They could hide evidence, or they could wait to, maybe have some harsh words with that caseworker or worse. So we encourage you not to have any communication with the victim or the alleged abuser about the case until contacted by APS. We talked about that you would receive a call to verify your report. At this point in time, we don't give any other feedback to our reporters. We're not going to acknowledge whether a report was made or what the findings of that report was. Now, there are times that the reporter is also a person that's involved with the individual. So let's say that you have two children. One is the alleged abuser, the other is the reporter. Through the course of our investigation, that reporter becomes another with information and someone that we want to work with to make sure services are in place. So we're going to continue to talk with that individual, but not in their reporting role. We're going to talk to them as the other with information, the sibling, the support person, whatever their other role will be. If you have any further questions, if you would like more training, we do have an email that you can reach out to APS directly, aging.aps, not very complicated. And you're always welcome to ask us questions. We do prefer, if it's specific to a report, that you go ahead and you call the hotline. We cannot take reports within programs, so that just saves you a call. If we say, yes, we think that's reportable, we have to have you hang up and call our hotline. So if it's a question about an APS report, please call there. Any other questions, you can just reach out to us directly. I think that's it.
Dana, there is a question in the chat. I find the process frustrating when I have clients with Alzheimer's and have no family. If I call about self-harm and the individual refused assistance, then to me, the person is still unsafe. I have seen facilities discharge individuals when they live alone and their house condition is unlivable. I understand the rights of the patient client, but in some cases, they should not be allowed to make these decisions on their own.
Yes, that is a very challenging situation, and especially at the point of discharge. These are very complicated cases for APS. Anytime we're working with a hospital and trying to determine what we view as a safe discharge and the hospital or long-term care facility views as a safe discharge, there can be some competing interests. I did fail to tell you that individuals have the right to refuse services as long as they have the capacity to do so. So in some situations, if the individual is, the obvious case is if they're non-communicative. Well, that's not obvious because some people can maybe not have verbal speech, but still have capacity and they can communicate in other ways. But if a person were like unconscious, that's the kind of situation I'm talking about. We are going to go ahead and work in what we call client's best interest to conduct that investigation. So there are times that an individual, because of a medical condition, we feel like they lack capacity. We do a brief screening, and then we're going to work over the course of the investigation to formalize that screening, like with a medical professional. But at the point of our screening, if we feel like that individual lacks capacity, we're going to go ahead and move forward so that we can assure that that person is safe. If you're making reports in situations like that and you have any proof, any examples, please give those, because it does get challenging for APS in situations like that as well.
That's a difficult question because as ombudsman, we encounter the same thing and we are purely resident directed. So if we've got somebody, we have a saying in the ombudsman's office, people get the right to make poor decisions. But if they're decisional still, we have to honor that. But if they're not decisional is when that changes there. And then we go to their representative. But it gets really sticky sometimes. Dana, thank you for this information. It's really great. We've got a lot of people who want your slides. So know that. So I'll be making sure they get on the website for everybody to be able to have access. And so I want to ask about a specific situation. It's a hypothetical, but we've heard things like this. So you have somebody at home, they live at home, and they've got a caregiver coming in, and the caregiver says to them, the individual, and the person doesn't want to take a bath or a shower. They just don't want to bathe. So the caregiver says, I'm not going to give you your food unless you take a bath or a shower. Is that considered abuse?
Oh,
this is chronic. It's not just the one time, one and done. I'm not doing it. I'm not going to feed you. I'm not going to get you your meal unless you.
In situations like this, what I always do is I pull out the act and I go word for word from the act. And I think that would, because what I'm thinking about is if I hold up the definition of neglect again, it does talk about withholding basic necessities. So that would be a method of withholding food as a basic necessity. So I would accept that.
Okay. And I could imagine that this is difficult to investigate because you don't have a camera in there. And now it becomes two people's words, that you're vying with. And sometimes it could just be a rub in relationships. as well.
Yes.
So I can imagine this can be pretty difficult.
Yes. Although, what I do like to stress is that services don't necessarily come after investigation. So if we go in and, APS observes problems, hopefully they're going to be making referral recommendations to assist in that situation, whether or not they believe there's abuse occurring. So that's, even if we don't have a finding, hopefully they'll still get some assistance.
So if a finding it does happen, um, uh, like if it's a self-neglect, let's say, is there a negative outcome for that? Like, does that mean now the person's got to go to live in a nursing home, or they've got to be taken away from their home? So, you
Not at
know,
all.
okay, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of our, um, what did I call it? Now I'm losing my words. Well, one of our goals in APS is that an individual remains as independent as possible, and we are going to work with them. Like the ombudsman program, it is very self-directed. So if they want to stay in that home, we're going to do everything we can to keep them in that home. Like we said, we have funding available that we could do some minor home repairs. We can do cleanups because hoarding is a situation that we see a lot with self-neglect. And then we can get some services in place. Our self-neglect cases are open for a very long time in most situations because we do have to establish that trust. And if you're familiar with the like the technique of motivational interviewing, we have to help that person see how their life might be better in little bits. If we're able to do some things for them or make some slight changes with them. And so it takes a while in those cases to build up those trusts, to change the mindset so that we can get them maybe in where they're not so much at risk. They may still live differently, but hopefully they're not in a way that's risky to them any longer.
Right, right, right. Um, and um, so when you do have that finding, then one of the things that you will do is to see if services can help fill that area that the person needed. So they might need more, even a change in caregiver or something along
Yes.
those lines. Okay,
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
okay.
And
Um,
one thing when you talk about consequences, one thing I did fail to mention is there is one consequence, not to the individual, but to the abuser. If an individual is a caregiver, so whether they're paid or unpaid, so we call it formal or informal, and caregiver is also defined as they meet one activity of daily living. So even in those examples where I'm just bringing you food, I would be considered a caregiver. If we have a finding that is substantiated at our highest level, which is clear and convincing, so 75% of the evidence indicates that that individual is being abused. So it's not somebody's word against another, that's 50-50. Then their name gets submitted to the registry. And that means that those individuals cannot work as a paid caregiver in the state of Illinois. So they can appeal that decision. Those individuals have rights as well, but that is something that I should highlight, that there is a consequence to those abusers that are caregivers.
and what is that consequence? Like, is
Placement
jail
on the registry. Their name goes on the registry, and
just
so they're no
registry?
longer,
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So when it comes to financial abuse, I remember there being a story that I heard a while ago, and that was about a family member who had taken the mother's money, the father's money, and they built a pool in their backyard. And now their parent didn't have any more money because they were the power of attorney for property, and that's what they thought they could do whatever they want to do with the money, even though mom was still alive. Now that pool is built. What do you do there? I mean, they can't get the money back from the pool.
Well, actually, APS doesn't have any legal authority to do any work to get money back. What we have to do is stop any further funds from going out. So we can help people, stop payments on accounts, to freeze accounts, things like that. We would have to work with the Attorney General's office if the individual wanted to do that. We would engage the individual to see if they wanted to file a police report or do any other reporting to entities that might have the ability to recoup some of those funds.
Yeah, because I think in this particular instance, the family member, the elder, was like, "Well, I'm not going to put charges against my son
Yeah.
And so it just kind of just dropped,
It
at
it's
that point.
very common. We see a lot of cases that are repeated because individuals don't want to take action against a family member or a trusted individual, things like that. So they may refuse the investigation, and then another report comes up. And it's kind of that motivational interviewing again. You go out there, you speak with them, you talk about, you know, again, we're an advocacy intervention model. We're here to help everybody. Let's
Mhm.
make sure that your needs are met. And eventually, I think that we have some success with that.
And when it comes to those financial scams that you talked about, that's not something that you do investigate. We did do, for everybody's knowledge, we did do a resident family support council around senior scams, and Karen Cloppy did put that into the chat, that we have that video. So know that that's there. So you can also, we highly encourage everybody to take a look at that video, because it really was extremely helpful in what happens. My own mother had a check washed. And so she was subjected to being scammed. So it was another type of thing that's happening out there very, very frequently to people. So we want to make sure that everybody here stays protected. Um, and you talked about the suspicious death piece.
Mhm.
Now, do you investigate that in nursing homes too, or is that just purely home related?
Um, that's a very good question. I'd have to get back to you on that, to be honest. That is something that I have to go to our general counsel on, because it is in the act, which describes our eligible adults as being individuals who reside within the community, but it's its own section. So it's questionable. Um, I would think that public health would supersede us on something like that, but I definitely can get back to you on that.
Okay, yeah, because I'm just curious about that. And the other piece that made me curious as well is that over medication, which can be definitely a sign of abuse, particularly if they're doing it so they don't have to care for the individual anymore. They're just medicating them so that
Yeah.
they're just become this person that just sits there all day long. And that's something I think everybody needs to be really mindful of, is about medication. And we did do a resident family support council as well on psychotropic medication and aging. Again, you'll also find that one as one of our YouTubes, because that is something that we all have to be astutely aware of in long-term care, in the aging path, is that there is a tendency when mom or dad start maybe having a reaction to something, a behavioral reaction, that all of a sudden we say that the dementia is escalating and we start putting them on a psychotropic medication. And that may not necessarily be the right path to happen. So you should be going into that consciously whenever you do that. I'm looking to see, Stephen, were there any other questions in the chat?
I am not seeing any other questions, just a lot of people asking for the slides.
Okay, great. I also did have one. So what type of entities become the provider agencies? I mean, you said that you've got 30 some odd provider agencies around the state that
Mhm.
the Department on Aging contracts with. What type of entities are these?
Most of them are aging entities, but not exclusively. I mean, we have some domestic violence. I would say that's probably the second most common, and we had some mental health agencies. So places like Center for Prevention of Abuse, Metropolitan Family Services, Senior Service Associates, um, Locust Street Resource Center, Swan down in the southern part of the state, Shawnee Alliance for Seniors, Senior Service Associate. Did I say that? Senior Service Associates. What I was trying to say is Senior Services of Central Illinois. Those are some examples of some of our provider agencies.
So they're located throughout the entire state. I know the Illinois Department on Aging has separated the state into 13 different regions in the state. So every region has at least one
At least one.
that's represented. That's fantastic to know.
Mm.
And if I wanted to get, does it come through the senior helpline, or could I contact that agency directly?
It's probably better to go through the senior helpline. Some of our provider agencies choose to have all of their intakes go through the senior helpline, and then other agencies accept reports on their own. And we say the senior helpline, but there are actually two phone trees that the senior helpline associates accept. So they have the regular senior helpline calls and they have the APS report. So if you call that number I gave you, it's actually going to ring in on a different line and you're going to bypass a lot of calls. It's going to be quicker. But we do reserve that for APS calls because we want to make sure that if there's an emergency situation, that we're getting that information, getting people out there.
Okay, and could you give us that number again so we can put it into the chat? We're getting requests for that.
1-866.
I'm sorry, what is it?
1-866-800-1409.
Okay, we got it. Thank you. That would be really helpful for people to be able to have that as well. So that's good. Let's see. One other question that I did write down, because as I'm listening, I'm like, oh, taking notes myself. If somebody doesn't want to do anything about it, so I'm the senior, I have, my caregiver there's verbal abuse going on. It gets reported by my daughter and that the caregiver is doing this. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do anything about it. What happens then?
Then the case is closed. So we listen to what they're saying as long as they have the capacity. In your example, it sounds like they do. And we, depending on how much information we've been able to gather, some people will talk with us for a little bit. Some people don't let us in the front door. But if they talk with us for a little bit, we may be able to offer some services. We're definitely going to leave a business card or a way of contacting us if should they change their mind. But otherwise, that will be the end of their contact with Adult Protective Services. It's a little different for self-neglect. We do ask our provider agencies to go back a second time just to make sure that they haven't changed their mind. Because again, we recognize that part of self-neglect is establishing that rapport with individuals sometimes because they may be reluctant for whatever reason to seek services. So if they get a refusal, they're going to politely say, I'm going to check in with you in a few days just to make sure that everything's okay. You haven't changed your mind. And then they're going to go back a second time and offer services. If the individual refuses at that point, then we will close the case.
And along those lines of that self-neglect, we did get a question in the chat. Could you review again the guidelines if a participant is a suspected hoarder and what to do?
So hoarding in and of itself is not reason to make a report. There has to be a substantial threat to that individual's health, welfare, or safety. And again, it goes to what we were saying. People have the right to live as they choose. So you'll be looking for things like if papers on the oven, papers on a gas oven where there's a pilot light, moldy food, unsafe walkways. That's one we look at. And then not to bring us down at 4 o'clock, but any type of feces. I'm always a big, if there's vermin that it's clearly they've defecated, human feces, that gets reported right away because that's very contagious. So if there's a reason to believe there's a substantial threat because of what you're observing, then make that report to the hotline. We will go out and engage with that individual. Like I said, we'll make 2 attempts, and then it is usually a very slow process with that individual, helping them recognize that there's a need and then what are they willing to do about it. What they're willing to do about it may not be what we want them to do about it, but we'll take what we can get in those situations.
Okay. Yeah, I can imagine that can be very difficult. Do they bring in counseling services then? Like, would you be suggesting that counseling services come in and help work that situation?
Absolutely, because what we don't want to happen is to get that person to engage with us, clean it up, and then have it happen all over again. So when we get those requests, that's usually something that my feedback is, okay, is somebody offering counseling to them? Because we want to make sure this is ongoing.
And something that I've heard happen with people is, so they are a hoarder, and then somebody comes in and they recognize this and they say, it's not safe for you to live here, you're moving into a long-term care facility, and the person just goes. They feel like they're unempowered because they've been told that shame on you, you're doing wrong, your habitual habit is not good, you've got bugs, you've got vermin, you've got whatever. And so now you're being taken out of your home. And so now you have to go live here. I've heard that situation happen so many times, that such an unempowered situation that happens. Would that be considered in itself that somebody was being pulled from their home? This is where it gets complicated.
We have no authority to remove someone from their homes, and we're acting against the act if we go against their wishes and they have capacity. So those are extremely challenging situations because at any given time, we're working with someone who lives in a very dangerous type of situation. And we're working with them to try and make them safe. Whatever that looks like that they're willing to do with us is what we're working on.
Mhm.
Luckily, we do get a lot of support. Those individuals tend to allow us to work with other entities. And so I find it takes a village. So we're usually working with city, we're working with code, we're working with social service providers, we're working with anybody that they have in their lives, just everybody offering whatever piece that they can offer to help protect that individual.
Okay. Yeah, because we'll get the phone call sometimes from that individual saying, I was taken here against my will.
Yeah.
And, you know, and then it becomes to us as ombudsmen then, or the individual wants to leave, they can leave. But did the abuse happen by the person being pulled out of their home to begin with? Because they were just, an ambulance came and picked them up and they
Yeah.
were told they had to go. So that's where it gets really sticky sometimes, you know, life is complicated.
It is.
And that's one reason why we have these meetings, is to try to help uncomplicate it. But the message that I'm hearing is, when in doubt, even you can just call. We
Yes.
can call that number, the 1-866-800-1409. And if that we can from there talk through the situation, say, is this abuse? Is this not abuse? And we'll get the guidance, the support that we need to have in order to make sure that we're doing right by that individual.
Absolutely. And then don't forget, you can also email questions to aging.aps@illinois.gov.
That's
If we'll
great.
choose email over. I would recommend not, if you're questioning reporting or not, that you go ahead and make the phone call though, just because, like I said, we can't take the report through the email. So we'll have to have you call the helpline anyway.
Yeah, and sometimes having that email just for the initial story can be, you know, or as you get more details happening, it can sometimes be really helpful to be able to have that. So thank you so much, Dana. We so much appreciate you being here. This was a really important topic to have, because again, it becomes one of those subject matters that people know it exists, but what exactly does this really look like? What is considered abuse? What isn't? You did a wonderful job of helping to explain that to all of us. So we really do appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the recording. I'm going to stop the recording. And if I can figure out where to do that, because they changed things on me. Here we go.